Hello and welcome. I'm Lindsay Nelson, TEA's Executive Director and your host today. Thank you for joining us for the TEA member-exclusive webinar, Behind the Data, a look at the 2021 Theme Index and Museum Index. We're glad you could be with us. For those of you who are new to TEA or may not be familiar, the Theme Index and Museum Index has been developed annually for the last 16 years through a collaboration between TEA and the global economics practice at AECOM, and is globally regarded as the definitive attendance study for the themed entertainment and museum industries, which is why we are so happy to have this opportunity to open this exclusive webinar to TEA members. Since this event is being recorded, I'd also like to welcome our members who are not able to join us live, but who are watching the recording and who submitted questions in advance to be read during this broadcast. We appreciate your participation. As part of TEA's commitment to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, we are thrilled to debut live simultaneous translation for this webinar through a program called Wordly. For those of you attending the event live, in a minute, you will see a pop-up box on the top right corner of your Zoom screen, inviting you to use the tool. Click on the invitation to enable real-time interpretation and use the drop-down menu to select your preferred language. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Brian Sands. Brian Sands is a self-described numbers guy who has a broad background in urban planning and real estate economics, and who most recently became manager of the newly formed innovation sector at HKS, a global architecture and advisory firm. He has been active in the themed entertainment industry since the late 1990s, when he was hired out of the investment banking industry by John Robinette and into the London office of what has become AECOM Economics. In 2009, he became a contributor to the Theme Index and went on to coordinate its production for 8 years. Since 2014, he's been active in TEA leadership, including serving as treasurer, and is currently wrapping up his second term on the TEA International Board. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks very much, Lindsay, for that kind introduction. And hello and welcome to everyone on the call for today's TEA members only webinar focused on the recently released 2021 TEA AECOM Theme Index and Museum Index. Every year now for nearly 2 decades, the report has provided a beautiful and highly informative review of attendance and related trends at major attractions across the globe. Preparation of the report every year is a huge effort. And on behalf of TEA leadership and its membership, as well as the themed entertainment industry at large, I'd like to say thank you very much to the AECOM team behind the report, who you will see in a moment on the screen. There we go. So our panelists tonight will each have the opportunity to talk, and I'm going to give you a little bit of information about them and also a fun fact about each one as well. So let's go ahead and start by meeting our first panelist, John Robinette, who is a senior vice president at AECOM, where he leads the economics and advisory practice in the Americas. John has been in the themed entertainment industry for an amazing 42 years now, and he specializes in leisure, culture, and real estate economics. I also want to note a couple of fun facts about John. First, in the interest of full disclosure, as Lindsay mentioned, back in the late 1990s, John hired me into what would eventually become AECOM Economics practice in London. As a result, he has been a lifelong leader and mentor for me. Many thanks, John, for all you do for the industry and for what you've done for me personally. Going even further back in time, you'll be amused to learn that John, as a part of a Disney management training course in 1979, played the character of Tweedledum at Disneyland. Oh, for a photo of that. During that experience, John gained great insight into human nature. The little kids hugged him and thought he was great. The parents stood back and enjoyed the interaction. But unfortunately, the teenagers punched and kicked him. John, that sounds like really great training for being a parent or maybe as a consultant. Okay, let's get down to business. So John, what can you tell us broadly about the themed entertainment industry in 2021?
Well, thanks, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for showing up today. It's good to see you or hear you. I'd like to briefly discuss the good news we've discovered in the 2021 theme index, followed by a little bit of bad news, and then some of our views on the future. So first, the good news. 2021 was a very strong rebound year overall, and we see this continuing in 2022. The overall theme parks globally grew 70% from 2020 to 21. Now that's an extraordinary growth. If this was any other year, that would have blown our minds, but it wasn't. So with the rebound, it varied from country to country, and everyone that we track was up this year. So that's good. Second bit of good news, we've got an inverted yield curve this year. For those of you in finance, you know that usually applies to short-term and long-term U.S. Treasury curves. But what we track is the growth of GDP, gross domestic product, over the years, and the growth of the themed attraction industry. And we've been doing this for 40 plus years. I can't show that all to you on the graph, but we have been. Historically, the industry usually grows roughly the same as or a little under GDP. And you can see that here in the early 2000s. There are some exceptions, of course. And you can see in the 2010s, the curve inverted with attendance growth higher than GDP growth. And that was due to a lot of reinvestment in the industry and a generally good economy. And this is for the US, by the way. Then you'll notice that the attendance drops below GDP in 2019, and then, of course, falls off a cliff in 2020. We dropped 72%. Whereas the GDP dropped 34%. So, but what I want us to remark on is that we catapulted back in 2021. I call it the great inversion. You can see there that we can't even fit the growth of industry on the chart. It grew 136%, while GDP growth was 5.7%. So what does this all say, other than the fact that we're a bunch of nerds, is that our industry is now growing faster than the economy. And that's good. And we expect this to continue through 2022 and possibly 2023 as well. So third bit of good news, there's a real strong pipeline of projects that we're seeing being planned by the major operators and others. And there's future capital expenditures on the books of the clients. So this is a great indicator of continued future growth in supply, which is good for all of us TEA industry participants. Those are our clients, and that's what we need to keep going. Finally, North America had a tremendous bounce back in 2021, and the figures I just told you were for North America. So 136% growth over 2020 for North America, and as I said earlier, 70% for the whole world. So North American growth was driven primarily by pent-up demand. So a bit of bad news, China, which, as you all know, has recently been a real engine of growth for our industry, didn't bounce back as fast as the other regions. And this is due primarily to their strict COVID policies, which you're probably all aware of. But this has really cost them an attraction attendance growth and reduced growth in other industries as well. So finally, while we had a stellar growth year from 20 to 21, we're still at roughly 60% of 2019, so we have a ways to go. So what about the future? I think we'll probably run through this pent-up demand and savings in 2022, 2023, and then we're going to have to stand on our own as an industry. This means the industry is going to have to reinvest in new product, new rides, new shows, new attractions, and experiences, and they'll need to do this to induce repeat and new visitation. So overall, we see good signs of this in plan reinvestment and continued demand from the markets. So overall, our outlook, all things remaining equal, is generally good. I always say, you know, we've got a fundamental product in this industry, which is fun, and that's not going out of style anytime soon. So we feel pretty good about it.
That's great. Thank you, John, for that high-level review. And it's great to see that despite the continued challenges, attendance significantly improved in many places across the globe. As a follow-up, can we take a little bit of a longer-term view for a moment? Let's go back, wind the clock back to 2018, when attendance at the top 10 attraction operators passed the 500 million mark. and then went on actually to peak before the pandemic took hold in 2019 at 521 million. So as you can imagine, I and a lot of TEA members are wondering, when do you think we might get back to that level of attendance again?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. I'll try to answer it. Fortunately, we've been studying this a lot for clients. We've actually done a model that looked back in our industry 50 years to see what major disruptions have done to attendance, what kind of impact they had. And we looked at earthquakes, we looked at terrorism, we looked at, what else did we look at? Political unrest. We looked at hurricanes, other pandemics. So we basically took any major disruption to the industry over the last 50 years. And then what we did is we plotted the recovery curve for all the attractions from those disasters. And interestingly enough, while they weren't identical, there was a pretty narrow band of results in terms of the recovery curves. And they all dropped off drastically the first year of the incidents. And the second year, they kind of turned the corner and began recovery. And on the third year, there was rapid growth up to either close to or at the year of the incidents. So the model shows a 3-year recovery curve. Now, having said that, it really depends on how the pandemic plays out. Most of the other events we took a look at were short interval events. They happened and then it was sort of over, whereas COVID has been rather prolonged. I guess if I was to make a guesstimate, I'd say probably conservatively that the whole industry's probably not going to be back till 2023 or 2024. Now, some people will be back in 2022, but for the whole industry to come back, it's going to take a lot more. So that would be a sort of a planning assumption that I use if I was looking at my business. Now, that assumes there's no other major disruptions or disasters between now and then, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that insight, and fingers crossed for all of us that yes, things continue to recover and we can get back to the numbers that we were achieving previously. Mm-hmm. So thanks again, John. And now let's meet our next panelist, Francisco Refuerzo, who's a senior analyst with AECOM Economics and Advisory Team based in Los Angeles. Francisco has been working for nearly 10 years as a real estate economist, including for 3 years now, focused on experiential, leisure, and cultural projects. Fun fact, as a teenager, Francisco got an annual pass at Disneyland Resort just so he could have their churros and beignets whenever he wanted. And he has a special place in his heart for the Knott's Berry Farm boysenberry funnel cake. All right, that's kind of making me hungry, but snacks are going to have to wait. Francisco is going to tell us about attendance trends in 2021 in the Americas. Over to you, Francisco.
Thanks for that introduction, Brian. Definitely happy to see those two parks here on this list of North America theme parks. It feels weird to say that 2021 was a good year, but all things considered, North America theme parks kind of stole the show relative to the other regions. You can see here the 136% growth over the previous year, which is kind of astronomical. So if we go to the next slide, then we'll be able to kind of see some of the trends of that of this year. So visitation was up, although international visitors were slow to return and still are slow to return in many cases. But regional parks fared well because of this. They kind of led the way in focusing on their local markets, and other more destination parks in Orlando also took a regional focus too, offering Florida residents special ticketing and doing other like creative marketing and ways to get people into the parks because they had this loss of international visitors. So those were kind of two attendance trends in North America. In Latin America, the story was 54% growth is not modest by any means. It just kind of overshadowed by the triple-digit growth of North America. It's still tremendous growth in this region. Yeah, so travel restrictions and operating regulations varied wildly from country to country. You can just imagine how different they were in here in the US. They're different from state to state, and Latin America had to deal with international regulations. Grupo Xcaret, it continues to make major investments in parks, theme parks, eco parks, water parks, and luxury hospitality concepts all along the Bayan Riviera. They're kind of running the show down there. And another thing in Latin America is that for the theme parks, 2 of the top 10 theme parks were actually closed during 2021. La Feria de Chapultepec closed in 2019 and is being redeveloped right now into a new amusement park. And then Plaza Sesamo is also being redeveloped into a new concept as well. And water parks. Here you can see kind of the overshadowing of North America's improvement over the previous year, 177% year-over-year change for the top 20 water parks in North America, and then Latin America has 74%. So if you can go back to that chart really fast, I just want to point out that the Latin America, we're only counting the top 10 water parks. So the numbers here are pretty great for Latin America water parks the top on an average, gaining more attendance than the average top North America water parks. We can talk a little bit more about the differences between the two. Water parks in Latin America are able to compete with theme parks more evenly in terms of the attendance that they gain, that they attract rather. They're kind of like head to head with some of the top theme parks. And I think a major reason for that is that in North America, we kind of have a dominance of several large operators, and you just don't see that in Latin America in the same way. North America regional water park tend to be more regional water parks versus Latin America are kind of destination water parks. You see in the Atlantis resort in the Bahamas is kind of like a key example that attracts like people from all over the world. And so these water parks are very different than let's say the regional approach to like a Six Flags Hurricane Harbor or a Soak City. So these are kind of the key differences between the water parks in both of these two markets. But the pipeline in Latin America is really strong. You have Grupo Xcaret making major investments, and then you have new water parks being developed all throughout the Caribbean, and then those 2 closed theme parks that are going to be redeveloped that are going to come back to market pretty soon. So while Latin America isn't stealing the show this year, I wouldn't count it out for future years.
Excellent. Thank you for that review of the Americas, Francisco. And as a follow-up, let me ask, do you think that the shift at U.S. parks to more domestic attendance and similarly to more regional tourism will continue post-pandemic? Or might we see a return to pre-pandemic national and international tourism driving attendance at parks as well?
I think that the regional parks are going to stay kind of regionally focused. And a lot of the major operators have suggested that while international numbers aren't where they want it to be, they're starting to get to the point where, kind of like a pre-pandemic level. And some of them are targeting the end of 2022 as kind of hitting that mark. So we'll see. We'll just have to wait till next year's theme index.
Very good. That's great news. And yeah, we'll stay tuned. We'll be back here next year asking that question again. All right. Thank you, Francisco. And with that, let's move over to the Asia Pacific region and meet our next panelist, Beth Chang, who is an executive director with AECOM and has been based in Hong Kong for the past 16 years. Beth has been in the industry for 24 years now and specializes in development consulting for mixed use and leisure projects. I also want to note that Beth has a connection to the cover of this year's theme index. She worked on the economic feasibility study for Universal Studios Beijing way back in 2000. Well done, Beth. And I certainly hope that you've been given maybe a free pass to the park for life. All joking aside, Beth, can you please tell us about the Asia Pacific market in 2021?
Okay, thank you, Brian. Let's start at the big pictures. So there's the big pictures,
Oops.
right? If we see the overall theme park attendance in 2021 really only went up 29% from the shock in 2020. And as earlier John and Francisco has mentioned, yes, this is a lot lower than North America's 136% and the global average of 70%. So let's take a look at what happened, why the recovery was not as great as we had been expecting. Let's look at next slide, yes. So let's start with the Northeast Asia. This is where we see a suburban outdoor theme park where people can go out and take a fresh air. They generally perform better than urban indoor theme park. And this has been consistent not only in Northeast Asia, it actually has been consistent in globally that consumers shy away from indoor attractions. When you look at the Japan numbers, you probably would be surprised that their attendance numbers are really low. It's only about 1/3 of the pre-pandemic level. And this really is because the government imposed a very strict capacity limit. You probably won't believe that for the entire Disney park, Tokyo Disney Park, they can only accommodate 5,000 visitors per day. You can see how strict that is. And that is why you see the two Tokyo Disney parks and Universal Studio Osaka, they are all doing quite low attendance for 2021. However, in the fall of 2021, when restrictions were gradually lifted, we see crowds returning to celebrate Disney Sea's 20th anniversary and also to check out Universal Studio Osaka's newest Super Nintendo Land. So we were definitely very positive about this region. We really see excellent operators being very confident about the future. They have plans to continue to reinvest. And Disney Japan had just announced something really amazing that they will be looking at a 20% reduction in future attendance voluntarily to improve guest experience and to further its strategy of growing revenue per visitor rather than growing attendance. I think this is really a model for many parks to look at in the future. So if you look at Hong Kong, which is my backyard, Hong Kong Disneyland used to get 60% of its attendance from overseas visitors. And in 2021, there was 0 overseas visitors to Hong Kong. And on top of that, Hong Kong Disneyland's operation days were reduced by as much as 40% because of government restrictions. But in challenging times like this, Hong Kong Disneyland actually achieved a 2.8 million attendance, which is 40% penetration rate at the local market. This is definitely one of the highest resident market penetration rate I've ever seen in the past 20-something years. It's kind of unfortunate when we look at Hong Kong's own homegrown park, Ocean Park, which once was the best theme park in Asia. Last year in 2021, they had an all-time low of 1.4 million. There's a little bit of experiment going on looking at a life cycle of a theme park. Can the theme park be redeveloped into something different? Ocean Park had a plan to turn itself into an ungated commercial, retail, dining, and entertainment destination. I think globally, everyone was looking. Unfortunately, the latest news is the tender has failed. No developer went to tender for this project. So we're still looking, we're still observing, we'll see what happens next. And if we come down to Southeast Asia, the major park we cover is Universal Studios Singapore. We know Singapore is a very small country. It has a very limited resident market. So it has always been very, very dependent on the international visitor market. 2021, just like Hong Kong, Singapore basically had just about 0 international visitors. And therefore, we see Universal Studios Singapore struggle to keep at about 1.2 million attendance. However, Singapore is opening up in the past few weeks, and we see international visitors, business visitors, leisure visitors pouring into Singapore. And USS has the million land on the way, so the outlook is very bright. So the $1 million here is, let's look at the biggest market in APEC. What's going on in China? So actually, the pandemic has been going on for 3 years. And in the hindsight is 2020. We now know the first half of 2021 was actually the best period of time for Chinese parks. There was a short-lived optimism in the first half of 2021. That's before the Delta variant showed up. So people were traveling, they were planning to travel for a summer holiday. Overseas leisure trips were replaced with domestic travel. Most Chinese parks were actually able to operate for the entire year. Disney was only open or was only closed for 2 days. So Shanghai Disney celebrated its 5-year anniversary and was able to achieve 8.5 million attendance. However, domestic travel restrictions started to increase about halfway through 2021, and unfortunately, we very much anticipated. I have been anticipating for Universal Studio Beijing for 20 years. Finally opened in September 2021, and we had to face a much tougher market condition. Let's quickly jump to the APEC water park. So basically, it's flat. Overall attendance is flat, and we had mentioned that there was a small window of optimism in 2021 that we have overcome the virus. So if you have parks that can capture that short window and operate during that period of time, you will see that those parks actually perform just fine. Unfortunately, if your season is a little bit later when Delta hits, then the problem start to occur because vaccination program generally roll out much later and slower in Southeast Asia. So most of the Southeast Asia in 2021 were actually under very strict lockdown. So you will see parks with only 30,000, 60,000 attendance, and definitely it's very hard to look at those numbers. So overall, if we look at APEC, we look at 2022 and beyond, we think the bright spot really is in the Southeast Asia.
That's great. Thank you very much, Beth, for that great insight into the Asia Pacific market. As a follow-up, I'd like to ask you, given the remarkable bounce back in attendance that we've seen, John was talking about, Francisco was talking about, both in the global and the US markets. Obviously, China has not been in that situation, but I'm wondering, once the pandemic restrictions are reduced in China, do you expect to see the same kind of bounce back happen at that point?
I think the answer we all want to know, and we do believe, is the Chinese market will rebound. But I think the true question, the real question is, when will that be? And that will only happen when the Chinese government consider that the pandemic is over. It's on their term. It's not on anyone else's term. And they will decide when that is. Unfortunately, we are not looking at it to open up in the next 6 months. So I think we have another 6 months of tough time to go in China. But what will we see in the short run are going to be a lot more smaller projects or even temporary exhibit type of entertainment projects that can go into shopping malls. That we will still see lots of opportunities on that. The investment level is probably 10 million, 20 million US dollar. It's going to be much smaller projects for now.
Very good. Well, thank you, Beth, for that. Much appreciated. And we'll turn now to Europe and the Middle East. As you can imagine, it's pretty late there in the evening now. So joining us via pre-recorded video link is Jody Locke, who is an associate director recently returning to AECOM's London office. Jody has been working in the industry for 12 years, specializing in mixed-use development consulting. And until literally last week, she was based for 5 years in Hong Kong. However, she told me that despite this stint in the Chinese market, unfortunately, she failed to master Chinese writing beyond a few characters, apparently due to her focus on the attractions numbers instead. All right, very good, Jody. And with that, let's hear what she can tell us about the European and Middle Eastern market.
Hello, my name is Jody and I'm Associate Director of Economics at AECOM in London. Today I'm going to be talking about EMEA region. 2021 saw EMEA theme parks make initial strides towards market recovery. While still well beneath 2019 levels, a 63% rebound in attendance was registered over 2020 figures. This resulted in total attendance of just over 36 million across the top 20 parks tracked in this year's index. Moving on to some key trends, we observed that due to the seasonal nature of most EMEA parks, they benefited from being able to open throughout the peak summer season. Generally speaking, parks were able to open earlier in the year than in 2020, and this reflected in attendance performance. Focusing on Europe specifically, UK parks notably opened earlier than those on the continent due to a faster vaccine rollout. This benefited Merlin, for example, who has a strong proportion of UK parks in their portfolio. As a result of ongoing travel restrictions and travel hesitancy, domestic leaning parks recovered faster. Destination resorts such as Disneyland Paris's properties are more reliant upon international tourism as a dominant proportion of the visitor mix. In the face of capacity caps, operators such as Merlin and Disney placed a renewed focus on boosting per capita spending to help balance out revenues. It must be noted that besides capacity caps, rehiring issues had an impact on parks reaching their full attendance potential. Turning to the Middle East now, the pandemic hugely affected ambitious 2020 Expo targets in the UAE. However, investments made in the lead up to the delayed Expo mean UAE theme parks are likely candidates for our top 20 lists in the years to come. Major investments in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are also ones to watch. Finally, checking in on Africa, we observed very low tourism volumes and flight limitations, which of course impacted on struggling parks. Attendance is expected to return to normal in line with the easing of international travel. Moving on to the top 10 water parks, growth was registered at 24% versus 2020 levels to reach just over 5 million visits. This is notably lower than for theme parks and can be attributed to the presence of indoor water parks on our list. The general public were considerably more cautious when it came to visiting indoor venues, and restrictions were often tighter. That being said, 2021 marked a stronger year when compared against 2020, with recovery halfway back to pre-pandemic levels. Focusing on water park trends, outdoor parks generally outperformed indoor parks for the reasons mentioned previously around hesitancy to visit indoor venues and tighter control measures. Water parks too benefited from being open during the peak summer season. However, they do tend to be located in touristic areas, and tourism volumes remain suppressed through 2021. On a positive note, investments are continuing, with exciting new additions this 2022 season. Thank you for your time.
Well, that was a great overview of trends in the European and Middle Eastern market. And while Jody can't be with us tonight, John Robinette worked in the market for years and is in a great position to field a question on her behalf. So John, all things considered, the performance of Europe and the Middle East was really impressive, with Merlin identified as a major contributor to this. What's behind Merlin's performance?
Yeah, I think, Brian, that there are several reasons, and they're really consistent with what Jody said about the rest of the market. Merlin has a lot of regional attractions. They focus on the domestic market, and because European tourism was shut down, the parks that focus on domestic business did pretty well. So that was a real critical strength of the Merlin properties during the pandemic. Also, they had sort of an emphasis like other people because they couldn't quite get the volume on in-park spend or secondary spend, as they call it in the UK, to kind of provide revenues due to the lack of volume. So that helped them on the revenue side. And some of their parks actually achieved higher revenues than pre-pandemic levels in 2019. So they really did a good job of managing those per caps with smaller attendance. Also, like everyone, there was pent-up demand from the pandemic, and when the season opened up in 2021 in Europe, because the regulations were dialed back a bit, the parks that were more seasonal, which Merlin's parks, a lot of them are, did really well that summer of 2021. So that's another thing they did that helped. I think overall they just managed the situation really well on a lot of fronts.
That's great. Thank you, John. And sounds like there's some really good little gold nuggets there for the industry to take a look at and learn from, I would say.
Yeah.
Very good. With that, let's meet our next panelist, Linda Chu, who is a vice president with AECOM Economics and Advisory Practice based in San Francisco. Linda has been in the industry for 20 years, specializing in the economics of attractions with an emphasis on museums and cultural attractions and associated economic development strategies. Fun fact about Linda, her exposure to not just the economics, but also the creative side of the industry has inspired her to become the leader of the annual San Francisco Dragon Boat Championship. Look it up. The photos are amazing. Sounds like a lot of fun. I really like the combination of economics, creativity, fitness, fun, and family. It just sounds perfect to me. So back to business. Linda, what can you tell us about the museum market in 2021?
Thank you, Brian. It's so nice to be working with you again on the theme index. We come full circle here. Well, let's take a look and let's take a look at some of the numbers. So on the next slide, you can see that museums were really affected by factors very, very similar to theme parks. Although as year-round indoor venues, attendance still struggled in 2021 and didn't quite have the recovery that we saw in theme parks and water parks. Many museums did not open until the spring and were affected by capacity restrictions and some visitor caution with respect to crowded indoor venues. And so if we look at the top 20 museums here worldwide on the previous slide, we see that prior to the pandemic, attendance was over 105 million, which dropped then to 22 million in 2020, and then increased a little bit to 30 million in 2021, which was a year-over-year increase of 32%. So museum attendance worldwide reached around 29% of 2019 levels. So we still have a ways to go, to pre-pandemic numbers. There were regional differences, however, as you can see. The EMEA market share has declined during the pandemic. In 2019, it was the leading region for museum attendance with about 45% of market share. In 2021, this number was 37%. And you can see that it was actually overtaken by the Asia Pacific region last year. And to further underscore this point, if you look at the charts on the next slide, you can see on the left here that EMEA museums had a very modest level of growth year over year at 16% only, compared to 41% for Asia Pacific and 70% growth for top North American museums, which was great, which was the strongest performer. The Asia Pacific region, though, has a modest lead, if you're counting, in the overall recovery story, as you can see on the chart on the right here, with attendance levels last year at 39% of pre-pandemic levels. So let's now delve into some of the numbers, the story behind the numbers. Let's start out with North America. which really have the strongest recovery on a percentage basis. So despite closures and capacity limitations, we saw pent-up demand for in-person experiences, as others have talked about, and this extended to museums. In North America, museums that had to close special exhibitions abruptly in 2020 reopened them upon opening in 2021, and this drove visitors back, particularly from the resident market or closer in tourist source markets. On the other hand, the themed social events that had really started to drive large numbers of younger visitors, particularly at many major museums, did not really come back fully in 2021. And within North America, there was significant variation. So the free admission Smithsonian museums struggled much more than others, with some Smithsonians only seeing single-digit growth last year. In contrast, the National Gallery of Art, which is not a Smithsonian, but is in Washington, D.C., was a top performer, more than doubling their 2020 attendance, likely due to its outdoor sculpture garden, which opened earlier than indoor venues. And across the board, we did see new investments in outdoor experiences around the country in museums and cultural venues. But finally, I want to emphasize in North America, despite these numbers, museums were very active, innovative, and resilient. They were very engaged in DEI and sustainability issues. They expanded their online presence. Per capita spending was up, similar to the theme park industry. And there were new museums that opened, one of the most notable being the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures. I highly recommend it. I went there. And really the attendance numbers do not tell the whole story. Okay, let's talk about EMEA. A little bit of a different story here. So EMEA dominates the Global Museum Index typically, right? And it has many of the world's largest iconic encyclopedic museums. And as must-see visitor attractions, they are typically able to attract large numbers of international tourists. And reliance on this market is exactly what challenged them in 2021. Also, this is kind of a nerdy economist point, but when you start with very large numbers, it's much harder to have large percentage increases. So EMEA definitely experienced a pent-up demand that other regions did, but they had much larger numbers of visitors to make up, given the impact of international travel restrictions with that market segment. Still, residents, regional visitors, and some tourists attended, and there were crowds at museums. EMEA's museums, like others, doubled down on social media and technology with TikTok museum events. And like North America, there were new cultural venues opened, including Berlin's Humboldt Forum. We also expect the Grand Egyptian Museum in Giza to open by the end of 2022, which when it opens will be one of the largest archaeological museum complexes in the world, featuring King Tut's entire treasure collection. So that will be featured in next year's. And finally, let's head over to Asia Pacific, which was, sort of kind of in the middle of the pack. The region's, kind of museum growth was dominated by China, no surprise, where there were nearly 400 museums added in 2021, including the Shanghai Astronomy Museum, which is considered the world's largest planetarium, over 400,000 square feet. And most of China's museums have free admissions. I will say, I think Chinese museums showed great innovation in 2021. So many museums set up online presences with social media platforms, Bilibili, to reach younger audiences. The Henan Museum partnered with Henan TV to produce the night banquet in Tang Dynasty Palace, which features 14 dancers dressed as ceramic figures from a famous painting in an immersive digital projection theater. In Shanghai, residents could see life-size recreations of 29 works from Spain's Prado museums, part of a pop-up exhibit in the Shanghai metro station. And many museums really invested in their earned revenue generators, which we've seen for a long time in North America. We haven't seen it as much in Asia. So they did things like murder mystery games based on their collections and unique collection themed food items, such as artwork character popsicles from the National Museum of China. And of course, we saw new museums in the region. In Hong Kong, two very long awaited museums, which we worked on a long time ago, have opened in the West Kowloon Cultural District, plus a Museum of Contemporary Visual Culture and the Hong Kong Palace Museum, which features artifacts from Beijing's Palace Museum. So overall, I think we are very optimistic about the museum industry, despite the numbers lagging a little bit behind the theme and water park industries. Museums are showing tremendous levels of innovation in engaging visitors around their mission and in developing earned revenue streams. And we're really seeing growth in the industry with new museums opening and major expansions. And while we don't have a crystal ball, we would expect to see major increases in attendance for 2022, and are hearing this from a lot of our museum clients.
That's great. Thank you for that review of the museums market, Linda. And I'm so glad to hear that despite some of the challenges on the attendance front, that there's a lot of creativity going on. That's exciting for the industry as a whole, since I'm sure there will be others who are looking at those ideas and thinking, we should do that too. As a follow-up, let me ask you, the pandemic obviously continued to significantly suppress demand at a lot of museums in 2021. And it appears to be hindered by their largely year-round and primarily indoors only offerings. But you also noted that some museums were able to counter this via special exhibitions. And I wondered if you could give some examples of this and if there's an opportunity for other museums to learn from these as well.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Great question. I think some museums really hit the ground running when they open. And historically, special exhibitions have always played an important role in driving year-to-year variations in museum attendance in all regions, particularly in EMEA and North America. North American museums in particular this year did very well in moving forward with special exhibitions and really using the time off to be prepared for their reopening. So some examples might include the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. They saw a 168% increase in attendance year over year, in part due to their Marvel Universe of the Superheroes exhibit, which I actually had the opportunity to attend with my family in 2021, so I was part of that number. California Academy of Sciences opened 5 new exhibits in 13 months, including exhibits on popular topics like sharks and bugs. Bugs exhibition actually came from New Zealand, and I saw that one. It was fantastic. This led to a 169% increase in 2021, so there's great variability. And then, of course, the American Museum of Natural History featured special exhibitions, which they are known for, including T-Rex, really kind of a blockbuster topic, the Ultimate Predator exhibit, and a redesigned Creatures of Light exhibition, which if you haven't seen it, you should see. It is one of their very popular and most beautiful exhibits on bioluminescence. So all these help kind of bring back local residents and closer in regional tourists, which are the market segments that can really more quickly respond to special exhibitions. But I do want to point out, and I would be remiss if I didn't, that museums are moving beyond kind of the live and die by blockbuster exhibitions concept. I think some of them are really seeing some of the challenges around that. So we are seeing investments in permanent new experiences, signature programs targeting new audiences. Cal Academy, I think there's a picture earlier, developed their Wanderwoods outdoor exhibit as a response to the pandemic. AMNH, of course, is opening the Richard Gilder Center for Science Education and Innovation, which has been over a decade in planning, expected to open February 2023, and is going to include many new exhibits, including an immersive theater, the Invisible Worlds Theater, that allows visitors to really experience all sorts of scientific visualizations using new technologies. And I would say across the board, all of the cultural attractions we work with, from very, very large to very small, including museums and cultural centers, botanical gardens and zoos, they are all exploring immersive visitor experiences. They're being careful about it, and they want to make sure it's tied into mission. But they all share similar goals with these investments, right? They're looking to increase attendance, earn revenues, engage younger, more diverse audiences, and frankly, just do a better job in telling stories related to their mission.
That's great. That's very exciting to hear. And yeah, it is all about telling the story, whether it's an entertainment or an educational story. And yeah, I'm excited and enthusiastic now to go visit some of these museums. So thank you, Linda. Okay, that was a great overview of the attractions and museums market in 2021 across the globe. Let's bring this back for a moment to TEA and its members. So John, I'd like to ask you a question. As you know well, TEA's membership is highly varied, but most are involved in some way, like you and the AECOM team, with the conceptualization and development of new attractions. With that in mind, can you connect a few of the findings from this year's reports to maybe some higher potential opportunities for TEA's members?
Yeah, sure. I would say a couple things come to mind. First, I think we all need to acknowledge that China's not the golden goose it once was. And I'm a little cautious about whether it will be anytime soon, at least under current leadership. There are opportunities in Asia, and as Beth said, this will probably come back at some point. But I think we need to start looking at other areas. So North America, we've reported, has done very well. We once sort of wrote off North America as a mature market without major projects happening, but now there's a lot of stuff being thought about. The major operators are planning new expansions and rehabs of existing parks. I think we can expect continued growth in the destination attractions. And a new little trend that we're seeing for America, we've seen it in Europe before, is conversion of some strong regional parks to destination parks by adding hotels, retail, food and beverage, and so forth, and other attractions, second gates. We're starting to see that being planned in the US and in North America in general. Also, we're seeing very strong interest in terms of products in immersive, as Linda mentioned, and specialty attractions. And this isn't just museums, this is commercial attractions looking at these things too, and including indoor water parks in all their various forms. There's a lot of those being looked at. I think because these specialty attractions require lower CapEx than major theme parks and smaller markets, theoretically they're lower risk. So the major operators and other clients are looking at these categories pretty closely. So I think we should all keep our eyes on that. And frankly, it's nice not to get on a long haul flight. We can work closer to home for those of us that live in North America, at least. Also, speaking of long haul flights, I would say the Middle East is still active. They're still looking to do new things there. I think the high prices of oil have really filled the coffers of our clients over in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia. As many of us have seen, there's a lot of projects being planned there. So I think, there's some business risk going into these particular markets, but you plan for it. And a number of the projects are eventually going to be built. I just say, a lot of them, particularly in Saudi, that are being planned may not be built as currently envisioned or built at all. So we have to, approach that with some caution, but there are some opportunities out there. So those are the things that have sort of come to mind from the research we've done in the index this year.
That's great. Thank you, John, and appreciate the telling it like it is, as it were, also, maybe taking some of the froth off of a lot of what we hear and see out discussed in the marketplace. We have a little bit more time, so I have another question for you, John, also related to the big picture. All things considered, attendance at parks in the US was really impressive in 2021. And beyond a more accommodating approach to the pandemic in the country generally, and the release, obviously, of some pent-up demand, I'm wondering if there are other factors that you think may have contributed to this performance in the US, perhaps such as the scale of some of the operators and maybe their experience as well, or any other factors as well that you think might have played a role.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, Brian. I mean, the pent-up demand is surely something that helped, and a little bit more of a lighter touch on the regulations, particularly in some states which weren't regulated much at all. So I think that helped. And I did want to share that with you, that in our analysis this year, what we saw driving attendance was operating days and capacity allowance. If they had the operating days and the capacity allowance, then the demand was there. We didn't see any lack of demand. So I think that's a strong point. Also, I think we should mention that there was record savings in the US, and this also drove people to get out of their houses once they could and go to the parks, and also to spend more. So it also drove the high increase in per capita expenditures that we've all been talking about here. So in terms of the operators, I'd have to say I was pretty impressed with the operators this year. The dexterity to kind of rapidly adjust to a regulated environment, which our industry really has never seen like that, where they're shutting our parks down. I mean, they instantly jumped on electronic ticketing and reservations, on app-driven queue management, on all these technological solutions, and they did it to actually increase the visitor experience and increase their revenues and attendance. So, and manage this this very challenging time. So I think the operators did a fantastic job. Now, some of this was happening before COVID, right? But I think COVID really accelerated the technological trends, and we've come up with some great things that have really improved the visitor experience. So that's good. And finally, several people have mentioned it, but I would say that the operators in the U.S. very quickly shifted to a new business model of having higher yield, lower volume. So they rapidly adjusted their admissions prices. They jacked up food and beverage and retail sales by more offerings and being clever about in-park sales. And overall, they really drove per cap. So they did a great job of that. I think, you know, they pushed revenues when they couldn't push attendance. So they did the best they could. And I think that kind of instant switch to high yield, low volume really helped. And, you know, some of them, as several people have mentioned, are thinking about maybe maintaining that a bit. So you have a nicer visitor experience. You have to pay more for it, but it's not quite as jam-packed with sweaty people. So so that's just off the top of my head what I think might have helped North America during the pandemic.
That's great. Thanks, John. And yeah, glad to hear about those trends. You know, none of us really want to be in the parks with a lot of other sweaty people, and we actually want to have a better experience, right? I mean, that's what it's all about. Right. It's about having a great experience. So that's really good to hear. So thank you. Our time is nearly up today, but before we go, a few thank yous are in order. So first off, on behalf of TEA and AECOM, many thanks to all of those who provided information in support of this year's report. This is critical to the report's accuracy and its utility, both inside and outside of the industry, and we greatly, greatly appreciate it. Also, thank you again to the AECOM team for producing another wonderful report and for taking the time to talk with TEA's members today. I'd also like to call out Martin Palicki, who edited this year's report, taking over for the first time from the report's longtime editor par excellence, Judy Rubin. Well done, Marty. Those were big shoes to fill, and you did a great job. In addition, a big thank you to our behind the scenes producer, Kelly Bailey of Kelly Bailey Productions, and Morgan Luchese of TEA's events manager for bringing this event together and ensuring that it went as smoothly as possible. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't, on behalf of the team today, and really on behalf of TEA's membership, generally thank Lindsay Nelson, TEA's executive director, for her tireless leadership and management of TEA, which has been exceptionally tough over the last few years. Thank you very much, Lindsay. Wow. Finally, I would like to just say it's been my privilege to have been involved with the Theme Index and TEA over the years, and to have served on the TEA International Board and its executive committee. I'm choking up here. I just want to thank you all for the opportunity, for giving me such great times, fun times, and responsibility. And I want to say I'm looking forward to seeing you at IAPA. Thanks, Lindsay. Please take the mic back.
Surprise ending. Brian, you think you're going somewhere and you're not, but thank you so much for hosting tonight. We really couldn't think of a better host, understanding both sides of the story, having been on the team producing the reports for so many years, but also wearing your TEA hat tonight. So thank you so much. I do just want to say that this session was recorded, and in the coming days, you will receive an email from TEA with that link so you can watch it at your leisure. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to our members who are joining us virtually, and we will see you again soon. Take care.
Thanks.